Okay, so this video is on how to dye a solid color. So in my cup here, I have about a half a cup of hot water, and I have about a half a teaspoon of dye powder. Nothing else, just water and dye powder, okay? So what you're gonna do is bring your water almost to a boil. And you can see in my pot here, you can see the little bubbles at the bottom. That means it's probably about hot enough. You do not want your water to be boiling. You want your water, take my mask off. You want your water to be just below boiling, so just below a simmer. And then once you get it hot enough, you're gonna put, this is a half a tablespoon, it doesn't really matter. You're gonna put some dye in your water. And so it should look like, let's see if I can move you up a little bit. Oops, sorry. A videographer, I am not. Okay, so then you will have a piece of fabric. Oh, I forgot to cut the sample. And I don't have my sharp scissors either. Okay, so I have a piece of fabric here. This is just nylon lycra, and I'm gonna put it in my pot. And I'm gonna give it a stir. And you will see that it starts taking on color. So you want to just stir it around. And I don't know, this probably wasn't pre-washed. You can see these white spots right here. And that is either I didn't pre-wash the fabric, or there is like oil or something left on the fabric, and that is why it's probably a good idea to wash all your fabric before you dye it. You can throw it into your washing machine with a cap full of Synthropol, and that will get all the weirdness out of your fabric and give you a much more even color. It'll get rid of any oil or dirt or anything like that. So what you want to do is stir this around a bit until you get a color that you sort of like. And I did this very pale because I didn't put a whole lot of dye into this pot. But you'll see once I put the citric acid in, that's the fixative, and the water will go clear and all of that dye will be absorbed into my fiber. So for now, you're just trying to get, the more you stir this around, the more you'll get rid of some of those white spots and you'll get a much more even color. If you just throw it in there and throw in the citric acid, you're going to get a very uneven color. It'll be more of a tie-dye effect. So kind of, you know, take your time, let it sit in the dye for a little bit, and you can keep checking it and see, you know. So my white spots are starting to fade a little bit, so I'm guessing it probably was just oil or dirt or something stuck in the fiber. The nice thing about dyeing yardage, instead of just say, I'm gonna cut out my leotard and dye my leotard, which I do not recommend, one, because it shrinks, but also because if you have a spot on your fabric, and sometimes you'll have a weird spot on your fabric, it just won't dye, or it'll dye a different color, or you'll get a streak or something along those lines. If you have a bigger piece of fabric, you can cut around that. If you just dye your leotard and you end up with that, you've just ruined a leotard. So I would suggest that you always dye the fabric as yardage, as opposed to dyeing, you know, just little bits and pieces of a cutout leotard. That never ends well for me. So you can see now that it's looking pretty consistent. I think most of those spots are gone. There's still a few in there, but I tend to not worry about it too much. I like the hand-dyed look. If I want a solid color, like a serious solid color, I would probably just go buy it unless I really needed like matching mesh and matching silk, and then, you know, but so I don't typically dye a whole lot of just plain solid colors. I kind of think they're boring, but that's just me. Okay, so I'm gonna say this is the color I want. This looks good to me. It's pretty consistent. And so what you want to do now is add like, I don't know, like a teaspoon or so, probably less. It doesn't, like I said, the citric acid, the Dharma site has all these specific instructions on what to add and how much to add, and I'm more of a fly by the seat of my pants kind of person, so I don't tend to follow directions well. So I just want you to know that you can experiment and you don't have to, you know, have precise measurements and techniques. So it's kind of fun to play. Just know that, you know, sometimes you may win and sometimes you may lose. So as long as you're not under a crunch, you know, definitely take some time to play with us. And once you add the citric acid, you'll notice the water starts getting much lighter, and that is because the dye is setting into your fabric. It's being fixed, and your fabric will get a little bit darker as your water gets lighter. And if you've calculated right, you should exhaust all the dye and your water would go clear. That doesn't always happen unless I'm trying to get like a really dark color, or if I'm, you know, I didn't add enough dye to start with, and then, you know, it just all fixed right away, and then it went clear. But this is getting pretty clear. I don't know how well you can see it from the camera. It's really hard to get a good angle. Like I said, I'm a videographer, I am not, and I really don't want to drop my phone into my pot of boiling water, or just below boiling water. All right, so I would say this is done. You can see it's a pretty solid color. It looks fairly uniform. And it's most of the white spots are gone. There's still a few here and there, but for the most part, I think this looks pretty good. So what I would do with this is I throw it in my sink and rinse it out a little bit, and then I will throw it in the washing machine. Okay, so now here's the thing about this water. This water now has citric acid in it. And if you wanted to dye another piece of fabric a solid color, say you had too much fabric to put in this one pot, so you were going to do it in 2 batches. If you just add more dye and throw your fabric in here, you're going to end up with a much more mottled look. You're not going to get the nice solid that we just got, because the citric acid is already in here. So as soon as you throw your fabric in here, it's going to fix. And so I'll show you what that means. So I'm going to add a little more dye to this pot. If I wanted a darker color on that pink, because you can see that, you know, the color I got is a bit lighter than some of my test swatches. So if I wanted a lighter color or a darker color on that pink, I would add more of my dye concentrate. If I want a lighter color, I add less of my dye concentrate. That's how you control the shade of your final color. So if you add a whole lot of dye, you're gonna get a really dark color. If you add a little bit of dye, you get a lighter color. All right, so this water now has more dye in it. I have not added any more citric acid. So I wanna show you what happens when I throw this in here. And I probably should have added more dye, because this is gonna not be very dark. I'm gonna add a little more dye to this, so it's dark enough that y'all can see it. Okay. So if I put this in here and I swish it around, it fixes immediately to my fabric. And if I have it folded, which I do because I want to show you how this works. So my fabric's not, it's not spread out, it's not evenly flowing, it's kind of stuck in this sort of shape. You can see that it's sort of folded together. So I'm going to swish this around in my dye bath a bit and show you what I get. Okay, so let's see if we can open this up. So when I open this up, you can see that this is very stripy. There's a lot of white dots at the bottom. It's got a nice sort of watercolor effect to it. It's not like just a solid straight up color. So this is a great way to do more of a organic, like flowy type idea than just a solid color. The downside is you will get some white spots if you haven't washed your fabric, which clearly I have not washed this fabric because it is getting all kinds of white spots on it. But I think this is a pretty effect. I think it looks sort of painterly, and I guess that's kind of the look I'm going for. So those are the two options. So if you put your citric acid in with your dye, you're going to end up with more of a watercolory tie-dye kind of look. If you put your fabric and your dye in your pot before the citric acid, you get a more consistent, even, solid color.